Good afternoon from London. This is Dr. Dermot Hudson, Chairman of the Korean Friendship Association of the UK, and Chairman of the British Group of the Study of the Future Idea. And today we're going to look at an important part of the DPRK's internationalist work. That is its support for the Palestinian people, and I'm very honoured and lucky to have here with me today a Palestinian and Arab activist who is also a university professor, but he's giving this interview under the condition of anonymity, who's going to talk about the DPRK's support for the Palestinian struggle. And I believe this will be a very important contribution to understanding the DPRK's profound internationalism, which is not understood by many people in the West, and there's attempts to slander people's career as quote unquote an ethno-nationalist state or a nationalist state. And I think it's very important we dispel these myths. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Dermot. I'm very happy to be here in London, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to a audience. I hope as many people as we possibly can about the DPRK Palestine solidarity work. It's an honor and a great pleasure to have met you. We've met a long time ago. You tell me about 2008, so we've known each other for over 10 years. Just a little bit of background about myself. I was very lucky enough to have studied DPRK politics over a course of 10 years. I had the opportunity and the great privilege to visit the DPRK when I was invited long time ago to the Korean reunification conference that took place in the DPRK. And I think it's important that I speak about this part because it will really help the audience or listeners to understand how I became involved in DPRK solidarity work myself. Back in the time when I used to be the chairman of the North American Committee Against Zionism and Imperialism in the United States, we formed, along with a comrade of mine, an American comrade, the Songan Politics Study Group. And we spent some time studying and understanding the ideology of the DPRK. And what attracted us to the DPRK from the outset, we always knew that the enemies of socialism in the world and the enemies of peace and progress and stability and Western imperialism and its colonial role in the occupation of Palestine and other places of the world. And what attracted us particular to the DPRK was its steadfast position on Palestine. We considered and still consider Palestine to be a litmus test of true socialist revolutionaries and people who are genuinely anti-imperialist. And the DPRK never, ever took a back step on Palestine. It has an uncompromising position because, as I got to know and many others, the DPRK operates on principles, and its principles have never wavered, and especially when it came to the Palestinian cause. The history of the DPRK position towards Palestine really clarified in our mind that this is a truly principled anti-imperialist force. And if there was anybody in the world that American or Western imperialism for that matter, it was going to be the DPRK. The DPRK, since the time of the founding father of the DPRK, the leader Kim Il-sung, established immediate relationships with the Palestine Liberation Organization. The relationship begins in 1966 when the great leader Kim Il Sung met with Yasser Arafat and later on met with George Habash of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The DPRK was never just about words. It was always action that spoke much louder than words. In 1966, the leader Kim Il Sung established relationships with the Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1970s, the DPRK provided arms and training to the Palestinian revolutionary parties, and in 1973, and maybe Dr. Dermot has more information about this, DPRK pilots were martyred. They fought Israel and gave precious blood of the Korean people to defend Egypt and Syria in the 1973 war against Israel. All in all, in the 1970s and the 1980s, both Yasser Arafat and George Habash, the Secretary General of the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, were received in Pyongyang and given full solidarity and support. Not for an instance in the long history of the DPRK has the DPRK ever recognized Israel. To this day, it's probably the only country that I know of outside of the Arab world that does not recognize Israel, does not have diplomatic relations with Israel, and has never compromised on the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. This policy continued with the leader Kim Jong il. And I heard from colleagues, and I don't know too much detailed information about this, that the DPRK actually had engineers that helped out in some contracts in Ba'athist Iraq during the time of President Saddam Hussein. The current leader, Kim Jong un, has continued his support for Palestine. To this day, the DPRK does not recognize Israel. Interesting, because of time limitation, I'm going kind of fast in all of these. Um, the When I was preparing for this meeting and interview, I looked up some of the imperialist propaganda that's being put out right now. I found, and you'll find this all over the internet, but the American imperialists have a lot of misinformation on the DPRK, and they don't even they put in money and academics and a lot of resources to spread false accusations against the DPRK. One of the latest ones that I found on the internet was this thing that was put up by a most probably CIA operated uh, organization. It's called the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and it's based in Washington, D.C. And what's interesting is I found an article that they published called DPRK Hamas Relationships. Most likely fake news, of course, but here's the thing. They've promoted, and a lot of Western mainstream media picked up on this story, that they found an RPG rocket that had DPRK inscriptions on it, DPR made in the DPRK. And they're trying to use that as a what they're saying is that the DPRK is providing arms to Hamas. Of course, we don't trust these media outlets, and at the end of the day, it's the DPRK's prerogative to confirm or deny or not even comment. Um, on my modest, in my modest opinion, the DPRK acts in very careful and well calculated strategic planning and maneuvering. They decide what they want to release as far as news. They've got main outlets that they go, the official outlets of the DPRK, and that's the one that we rely on. So whatever the DPRK wants to say, it will say it. It doesn't need any research center report its on its activities. And so, what I'm trying to say is whether the DPRK provides arms to Hamas or not is really nobody's business. but the DPRK. But I'm giving this as an example of how the American imperialists gather intelligence information against the DPRK and then promote it as propaganda to attack the DPRK and accuse it of supplying arms to what they claim to be terrorist organizations. Of course, these aren't terrorist organizations. These are organizations fighting for the liberation of their homeland. Last point that I want to make before I leave, before I let Dr. Dermot comment, is another example of fake news targeting the DPRK. This very same article under the title of DPRK Hamas Relationships accuses the DPRK of sending arms to Russia to help it in the Ukraine. And just to give you an idea of how absurd these accusations are, they claim that the DPRK is receiving money for sales of its arms in exchange for not just money but also food and fuel that it will get in return from Russia. And any of us, and Dr. Dermot can confirm this, who have been to the DPRK, they understand what the imperialists don't understand. And that's that the DPRK operates off of principles, not of political opportunism. When the DPRK steps into the Palestine conflict or when it goes to support the Arab cause, it does this because it's ideologically committed to combating imperialism. It doesn't need fuel, it doesn't need food, it doesn't need money. It has been sustaining itself quite well and developing and moving forward over the last 5 or 6 decades with the Songon politics, with the Chuchi idea, and they're doing quite fine. They haven't. They don't need to sell arms to get food or to get fuel or to get even money for that matter. And I'm, speaking from someone who's been to the DPRK, I've never been to a country where money didn't mean anything. I remember very clearly when I was in the Coroyo, I think it's Coroyo Hotel, Coroyo Hotel, that when I went to exchange money, the lady was giving me like 3 or 4 different currencies. Like money doesn't have any meaning in the DPRK because they don't need it. The people don't need it. The state takes care of everything for its citizens. I'll stop. I sort of went through that very quickly because we are on a time limit, and now I leave the venue for Dr. Dermot to comment.
No, thank you very much for giving this interview, this talk. I think it's been very, very good and so much in there. Just to comment on a few things that you've raised in it, I won't take them in any particular order, but you know, last remarks were very important. The DPRK, guided by the great Juche idea that was authored by President Kim Il-sung, developed by Chairman Kim Jong-il, and been applied by Marshal Kim Jong-un. The DPRK is self-sufficient, self-reliant, and as you say, it doesn't make bargains with others. It doesn't use expediency, and it doesn't need food from other countries. And I've seen these kind of things. Oh, the DPRK's done a deal with Russia to get food, to get fuel. But in fact, I mean, this is so much nonsense because the last 2 years, the DPRK has reaped a bumper harvest. And I was in the DPRK in April 2024, one of the first foreign visitors to be back in the DPRK after they closed the border for 4 years. And I didn't see any sign of starvation or people begging for food, nor have I ever, I've made 19 trips to the DPRK, including in the very difficult years of the Arduous March in 1996, but never seen people starving or, yeah, coming up to us and asking us for food. I've seen this happen in Brazil when people have food. Seen it once or twice in London. People actually are asking, "Oh, have you got a sandwich or something?" Uh, but never have I seen this in the DPRK. The DPRK's support for the stance taken by the Russian Federation over the conflict with Ukraine and its launch of the special military operation is done through principles. That is, the DPRK supports the denazification of Ukraine and also is opposed to the expansion of NATO. And this is an important question for anti-imperialists. So, I mean, that's why the DPRK has improved its relations with the Russian Federation, which previously weren't very good, because originally the Russian Federation and China had both voted for sanctions against the DPRK in the UN Security Council. I think both those countries now regret that, particularly Russia. So it's led to an improvement in relations between the DPRK and Russia, which the imperialists do not like at all. And they've taken to sort of inventing all kinds of stories like the ones you've just mentioned about the DPRK sending weapons in exchange for food. And even there are a lot of what I call fantasy stories about KPA troops fighting in Kursk. And this is just baloney. There is indeed a treaty between Russia and the DPRK, which includes a clause that either side can give the other side military assistance. But in fact, I read an article that in Russian through a translator that in fact Russia has never invoked that clause. So there are no DPRK troops fighting in Russia, and the evidence produced so far has consisted of photoshopped pictures of other nationalities other than DPRK citizens who can, in the eyes of Europeans and North Americans, have the appearance of a Korean, but in fact aren't Koreans, or certainly are not from the DPRK. And this kind of trickery is being played out a lot. And I mean, this sort of brings me on to the subject of the DPRK's internationalist assistance, which you've spoken about quite a lot. Yes, DPRK assisted the Arab side in the 1973 war against the Zionists and the US imperialists. A squadron of KPA pilots, some of the best pilots of the KPA, were sent to Egypt and to Syria, and they fought against the Israelis. And it is referred to by a prominent Egyptian general in his book, which I believe is called Crossing the Suez. He actually refers to that. And also DPRK construction experts built panorama museums in Egypt, in Syria and in Iraq. And I believe of those, only the one in Egypt still survives.
I visited the one in Damascus.
No.
Yeah, as far as I know, this has been a while. 10 years ago, it exists, so probably still there. Um, there's a monument for the fallen KPA pilots in the 1973 war. It's unfortunate that many Arabs or non-Arabs even don't know about this monument. I ran into it by accident. Yeah, I believe it's in the city of Ismailia. There's a monument dedicated to the sacrifices of the DPRK pilots that fell martyred fighting Israel in the 1973 war. And for any of the listeners or audience that will see this interview, look up the position of the DPRK throughout history. It is one of the few countries that has never wavered on the Arab identity of Palestine and that Palestine belongs to the Arab people. And as fact, most of the communist parties that followed the Soviet Union policy on the Arab Israeli conflict, including Arab communist parties, accepted the two state solution. The DPRK never accepted the two-state solution. And for those of the listeners that don't know what a two-state solution is, it's basically the compromise uh, Israeli Jewish state along an Arab Palestine, something that the DPRK never accepted. So, do you have any questions or do you want me to ask any questions or things you want us to discuss?
Well, uh, yeah, I mean, I would just say that with regard to the museum in Syria,
Mhm.
uh, there was reports that it was destroyed after the December events, but I
Oh,
don't,
just recently.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
You've
either.
heard anything about
No, no, I
that?
haven't.
I've heard that the memorial, the museum in Egypt is still uh, it still exists. I mean, I'd also just quickly mention the DPRK's involvement in Vietnam, uh, which was the other sort of main sort of military involvement of the DPRK outside of the country. They also sent KPA pilots to
Is
Vietnam,
that right?
as well as tunnelling experts and some artillery units. And very significantly, when I've been to the rebuilt Fatherland Liberation War
Mhm.
museum in Pyongyang, which is if you saw it on your visit to the DPRK
Yeah, there you go.
all those years ago, it's now a totally different museum, totally rebuilt and upgraded in 2013. But one of the things they put in a special gallery devoted to the KPA pilots who fought in Vietnam. I don't know if there's a similar gallery for those who fought in Egypt and Syria.
Right. Yeah, I didn't get to go to see the museum. If I may go back to the beginning of my talk, I had spoken about how I ran into Sundown politics and formed a study group in the U.S. One of the things that attracted us, we were going through, both me and the comrade that was with me, we were going through all communist systems and ideologies that existed. And we were particularly attracted to the DPRK because for two reasons. Number one, we thought it had the highest achievement in socialism. You know, if you compare it to the Soviet Union or China, for that matter, or Cuba, for that matter, as much as we support Mao's China's, as much as we support the accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution, and as much as we support the War of Independence in Vietnam, nobody comes close to what the DPRK has been able to achieve in terms of the successful building of a socialist system that is workers based and that is in the interest of the people. So we knew right away that we're dealing or we're looking at one of the forerunners, if not the most advanced socialist ideological system that we know in modern history. That was one thing. And then the other thing is we really benefited from the policies set forth by the DPRK. Let's put it this way. The DPRK is the only country in the world today that can tell the American imperialists, if you dare to think of attacking the DPRK, we can wipe out the city of San Francisco off of the face of the earth. Now, think about that for a minute. What country in the world today can threaten either Trump or Biden or the whole American imperialist system other than the DPRK? Nobody. Nobody comes close. And they're capable of doing that. Under the leader Kim Jong un, they've now developed their ballistic program. The leader Kim Jong il developed the nuclear program. The leader Kim Il sung built the socialist state that withstood American imperialist conspiracies with the client regime in the South Korea aimed at sabotaging and destroying the DPRK. They have continually demonstrated their success and victories over decades and decades. And the reason why they do that is because of Sangam politics and Chuche ideology. The ideological preparedness of the Korean people and the DPRK is phenomenal. They understand who the enemy is. They know that American imperialism and Western imperialism do not seek betterment of their lives and building their countries. On the contrary, they want to collapse their countries. They want to enslave the people just like they do around the world. And they also understand that putting the military forth as the most important priority for building the socialist state is the way to go. The Songan politics that have built the army today with its ballistic missile program is something all aspiring nations of the world, including the Arab people, need to emulate. We need to learn from the DPRK how putting army first policies, how committing the people to the ideological preparedness of building a socialist state and defending that socialist state is important for sustaining the success of building socialist countries in the world that we live in today. When we look around us and we see the Soviet Union collapse, we see China transform itself to a socialist market, a capitalist socialist mixed economy. When we see Vietnam, mixed economy as well, go into the globalization process, we see Cuba besieged and suffering under economic sanctions. We see Venezuela besieged and surrounded by American sanctions that are, forming an obstacle for building socialism in those countries. We understand how correct the DPRK path has been. And if it wasn't so successful, all that fake news media, all these research centers that are day in, day out trying to destroy the image of the DPRK around the world, they wouldn't exist. The reason why they exist is because the DPRK represents a genuine threat to American imperialism. Having said all that, I'm curious to hear from Dr. Dermot what his opinion is of the last time Trump met with the leader Kim Jong Un. What have you heard or read or know about the particulars of that meeting when the leader Kim Jong Un met Trump? Why did the DPRK do that? And then, perhaps now with Trump coming back to power, could we anticipate a second visit by Trump to the DPRK?
Well, that's certainly a very interesting and relevant question. Trump himself did a massive about face on the DPRK because originally, and I was actually in the DPRK when he said it, he was talking about fire and fury. He would unleash fire and fury against the DPRK. And I remember actually seeing the Worker Peasant Red Guard, which is a volunteer civilian militia of the DPRK, actually out on the streets ready to counter the US imperialists. And then at the UN, Trump made another attack on the DPRK, actually at, at the forum of the UN, which was something quite unexpected and sort of outside of normal and sane diplomatic practice. And then suddenly in March 2018, the news came through that he actually wanted a summit. He actually wanted to meet the Supreme Leader, Marshal Kim Jong-un, which was something quite surprising because, only a few months earlier, he'd been talking about
I want to destroy the
bombing the DPRK right off the face of the globe. And I think this reinforces what you were saying, that the US imperialists are frightened of the DPRK. They're frightened of the DPRK's nuclear deterrent because unlike the other countries that the US attacked, DPRK does have nuclear weapons and would use them against the US. And I think Trump suddenly realised this to himself and decided to try and negotiate himself out of the situation. The DPRK accepted the offer in good faith. The DPRK, whilst a very principled and independent state, can be flexible. They're not dogmatic. They don't have tablets of stone. So they accepted the offer. And I think also DPRK realised that a conflict on the Korean Peninsula would not be confined to the Korean Peninsula. It would quickly spread and become a world war. And I think they did not want to be seen as the people who were responsible for a world war, which would destroy a lot of humanity, to perhaps it. So they decided to accept the US's offer of peace negotiations. Of course, it has to be pointed out that actually DPRK US negotiations were not new. They actually went right back to the 1980s when the US started secret negotiations with the DPRK, as it were, through the back door. But Trump did something that I think really annoyed a lot of the US establishment. I'm in no way apologising for Trump. His internal policies are incredibly reactionary, and he is also a billionaire. He's part of the US ruling class. He's a capitalist, but he's from a different sector. He's made his money through property rather than through the military-industrial complex. But what he did was something different to other US regimes in that he direct negotiations with the US, which no serving US president had ever done. It'd been left to State Department bureaucrats to negotiate with the DPRK. And I think a lot of the US ruling class really hated him for doing that because it gave the DPRK a certain level of legitimacy because the US strategy has always been to try and deny the DPRK of having any kind of legitimacy. It's seen as basically an illegal entity by the US, even if they do not say this openly. So Trump basically upset that. However, I think his real motives in entering into negotiations with the DPRK were not honest, were not sincere. And we may not know for a long time what the real uh, motivation was. It's something future historians will uh, debate. But in my view, he wanted the DPRK to unilaterally disarm. He wanted the DPRK to restore the capitalist system. I think he even had visions in his mind of building his hotels in the DPRK. He had this in his mind.
He's also recently commented on building property in Gaza after the withdrawal of the Israeli army. It's ridiculous. But I mean, we're talking about a man who's a businessman more than anything. And in my modest opinion, I don't like Trump. I think he represents the imperialist and bourgeoisie in America, but he's just cutting a deal. He thinks that politics is like negotiating a real estate deal. He's come up with ridiculous claims like that in the aftermath of the Israeli defeat in Gaza recently. That he could possibly invest in some property. Of course, the Israelis themselves, as ridiculous as they are, have also proposed building resorts and resort type cities off of the coast of Gaza because it's off of the Mediterranean. But yeah, I agree with you. And I remember when I was back in the DPRK, the United States was trying to negotiate a settlement of sorts with the DPRK at that point in time. I think this was around 2006, so almost 20 years ago. The DPRK put out a, um, I remember reading some of its pamphlets requesting light water electricity generating plants to be erected at that time, something like that. I don't remember the details, but you are right. The Americans have tried to wheel and deal with the DPRK. But interestingly, even though Trump surprised the elites of America by going to the DPRK and trying to persuade the DPRK to compromise, the DPRK only got more resolved anti-imperialist positions afterwards. Looking at today, the DPRK fires its ballistic missiles when it feels the necessity to try them out. It sends signals to Japan to back off. We're looking right now at a huge South Korea scandal, a bribery and corruption of the puppet regime in South Korea. I'm even following a couple of people on Facebook from South Korea, putting out leftist and anti-government propaganda, which I haven't seen as much until recently. So signs of a crack in the ruling elites of South Korea. Um, so even though Trump can try to persuade the DPRK only gets more principled, more steadfast, anti-imperialist, and more sort of grabbing to its position than ever before. I'd like to, given the time is running out, I'd like to inform listeners a little bit about the situation in Gaza, if you don't mind. We just went through a year and 3 months of ferocious armed struggle, guerrilla warfare in Gaza, led by Hamas and led by the Qassam brigades. They have come out victorious in that war, and people need to know this, and that the Israelis have been defeated. They have sustained a military defeat in both Gaza and southern Lebanon that they tried to invade. The Palestinian people, as we speak, are celebrating in the streets what they see as a victory. There are Palestinian prisoners that have been released. Amongst them is Khalid Jarrar of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and many others to follow. This is an extremely important development in a political and military sense because this is an armed struggle that was waged by the Palestinian people as a whole, although the brunt of it was taken in by Qassam fighters who belong to Hamas. The celebrations are showing now, I didn't count them, but hundreds, if not thousands, of Qassam fighters that have come out from the tunnels they've been in for the last year and 3 months. There is an atmosphere of jubilance amongst the Palestinian people and the Arab world. And really, and this is the message I want to send out, armed struggle works. It worked in Vietnam, it worked in Korea, and it's going to work in Palestine. If you don't have the means to confront a occupying army as the Israeli army, backed by millions of dollars of US taxpayer money and arms and bombs and political support, guerrilla warfare works. And what had happened in the last year and 3 months demonstrates this. I say this because I and others have been talking about armed struggle as the only way to liberate Palestine for the last 20 years or more. And although the tragic loss of life was tremendous, we're talking about 50,000 people that died in Gaza, mostly civilians, mostly women and children, more than 100,000 injured, and with many people sustaining limbs that were amputated, and they're going to have to live the rest of their lives that way. It's very sad for us as Arabs and as Palestinians, but the military victory uplifts our spirits, and the people in Gaza also have been uplifted by what just took place in Gaza. So I think we've got about 5 minutes or so left. So I leave that to Dr. Dermot if there are any final comments that you'd like to make.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your remarks. I think they've been very interesting.
Thank you.
It's quite a deep subject, really. The question of DPRK Palestinian relations. I'm sure probably quite a lot more could be said, but there's not really time. And of course, about the DPRK's support for other struggles in all sorts of countries. There's quite a lot that has been written, and even more that can be written. It's a fascinating subject. And just on this question of DPRK US negotiations, which you raised earlier, there's quite a lot, I think, a fair amount of speculation with regard to Trump, who's sort of made, I think, some very vague remarks about re-entering into negotiations with the DPRK, but nothing appears concrete. My understanding is that the DPRK is not going to entertain it this time around. As you said, they've actually hardened their resolve since the negotiations that took place in 2018 and in the early part of 2019. The DPRK back in, I think, 2022, resumed holding annual anti-US rallies on June the 25th, which of course is the date that the Korean War, DPRK, was provoked. And Mr. Kim Jong-un himself, in recent speeches, appeared to rule out the possibility of negotiations with the US, actually saying, we did everything we could to reach an agreement, to reach an accommodation with the US. But, we learned that they didn't have the actual will to coexist with us. They only wanted the overthrow of the DPRK. And I personally think Trump's negotiations with the DPRK were really aimed at trying to overthrow the system there, but using a totally different method. And I think, and I'm confident that the DPRK will not enter again into negotiations with the DPRK. I think it's unlikely. I may be wrong. I think the US this time around would have to offer something very substantial, would have to come up with very concrete and detailed proposals before any negotiations took place. Is, as you say, Trump is a businessman. He sees everything in profit and loss terms, and I think he sees the US troops in South Korea as a drain on the US taxpayer, which of course is true. And he would be happier if they were either possibly withdrawn or more likely that he forces South Korea to pay the entire cost of the US occupation troops in South Korea. So that may have even been a hidden motive in his negotiations with the DPRK, saying to the South Korea, oh, look, if you don't pay for the US troops, we're going to take them out and you're going to be left to face the DPRK on your own. That might be the hidden motive. But anyway, to bring it back on track, I think negotiations between the US and DPRK are unlikely. And I'm confident that the DPRK will raise high the flag of anti-imperialism and will continue to struggle against US imperialism on its own home ground, as well as supporting anti-imperialist struggles all over the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dermot. Always a pleasure, and I hope we will meet again and have some more of these wonderful sessions, hoping to get the word out on the DPRK, on anti-imperialist struggle, and long live the resistance in Palestine till victory.
Until victory, yes.